Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for coming to this third talk on the IFAS research series. Our speaker today is Marcio Resende, an assistant professor from the Horticultural Sciences Department at UF IFAS. He leads a program in applied breeding of plants, specifically to develop sweet corn varieties which are maybe inbred or hybrid lines that are developed to address the concerns of growers, Florida growers. Now, these may include disease resistance, insect resistance, and also enhanced flavor. So he's working on sweet corn. He's also leading a collaborative effort to establish and develop a potato breeding program at UF. He combines theoretical and applied genomic research to breed and develop sweet corn and potato germplasm. His current research projects include the use of these techniques to develop sensory panels, genomic selection models to improve breeding and assembling the genome of sweet corn. And during this process, he's developed what I'm excited to hear about is an AI connoisseur nose, which smells and tastes the corn. I don't know. Let's hear about it. Please welcome Dr. Resende.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. And yeah, so interesting enough, I'll talk a little bit about potatoes and corn, but most of this work was actually done with blueberries and tomatoes. And it was a collaboration with um, other researchers at UF, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So yeah, thank you so much. We can do questions as we go or at the end, whichever you'd like. Okay, perfect. That works. So yeah, I'm in the horticultural science department. I was hired to be the sweet corn breeder, and we then went on to establish this potato program. And in the process of doing so, there were some areas of research that I was interested in researching, which is how to improve flavor of fruits and vegetables. And blueberries and tomatoes had a lot of data generated in this area. So that's how we used these two crops to test what we called the AI connoisseur, which is a tool for plant breeders to guide and to help improving flavor. We'll talk more about that. So um, just very briefly about sweet corn. Hopefully you all love it. It is this quintessential crop, right? Vegetable. And Florida is actually quite important in sweet corn production. It changes from year to year, but often as a state, we're the #1 state in fresh market sweet corn. So the corn on the cob type of corn that we buy in the supermarket, a lot of it is produced here in Florida. Um, the Florida program was actually quite influential and important for sweet corn as a crop. It was established in 1956, and Emil Wolf was the breeder who really had some pretty innovative ideas at the time to, without going into too many details, to explore a gene in corn that increases sugar content quite a bit. So nobody really thought that would work at the time. Emil created these materials, these hybrids of corn, where the amount of sugar present in the corn was actually quite higher than what was available at the time. And nowadays, virtually 100% of all the corn you buy in the supermarket contains this mutation, is a natural mutation, and basically has these elevated rates of sugar. Um, it's when we compare sweet corn with an apple, sweet corn actually doesn't have that much sugar compared to other fruits. A lot of the times the name is misleading, but higher sugar content actually also elevates post-harvest, for example. So the ears sit in the shelf for longer. So that was an important innovation. And I joined the program in 2017. And a lot of what we do there is really try to develop plants, to develop inbreds that uh, get to growers in the form of varieties and hopefully address growers' needs, especially in Florida. Currently, the program has two commercial hybrids in the market. These are the names of it. We never brand the hybrid names in the supermarkets. You just buy corn, but growers can actually choose to plant these materials and they contain UF background in it. But we'll move on to the potatoes, so just I can get into the flavor, which is the topic of today. I don't know if you all knew, but Florida is actually quite important when it comes to potato production. And that's because a lot of the window of when we produce potato in the time is basically right now. The plants are in the field right now, and we'll harvest in another few weeks, and so will the growers. And that's a time where the rest of the country doesn't have any potatoes, right? So about 36% of the national production of potatoes actually in representing the winter and spring season is actually done in Florida. And there has never been a potato breeding effort. So this was something that uh, a few years ago, I got together with a few other colleagues in the horticultural science department, and we figured that we could put uh, a second program, not that I was bored or anything, but just became a little bit more overworked. And we established a potato breeding program really to try to replace and develop better varieties than what Florida growers plant today. Um, there's basically two markets. A lot of it goes for chips, and about half of the Florida market is table stock, is supermarkets. So the reds and the yellows that we buy in the supermarket during the winter and the spring, most of it is produced in Florida. Um, but then in the context of my research, if I very briefly summarize a breeding program in general, whether this is an animal breeding program or a crop breeding program, the basic steps is it's a cycle where every year the researchers are identifying the best individuals for whatever best definition it might be. You can think about it as the most flavorful crops or the ones that have disease resistance or are well adapted to the Florida heat, for example. And then you cross them, you recombine their genetics, you shuffle their genetic material, and you evaluate them in the field. You plant them in growers' fields and you see if that attempt was good. And you do that over and over again. And for many years, and that's what a lot of my research program, there are many steps of this process. While I present it to you as an oversimplification, there are many steps of these processes where we were using artificial intelligence and machine learning even before this became buzzwords and became a cool topic, which it is nowadays. And this, for example, is to use information on the DNA of these plants to identify the best individuals or to identify what are the most important traits. What does the market want? Do we need to select traits that are more farmer-driven or more adapted to the fields and resistant to disease? Or what the market needs are traits that are more consumer-driven, nutrition, flavor, and so forth. So this is the context where my research started to work on artificial intelligence, and which is what led to the work with flavor. So very briefly, I'm sure many of you here have heard these terms before. These are just two possible definitions of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Artificial intelligence is the simulation of human intelligent processes by machines, mostly computers, and specific applications of AI include expert systems, language process, speech recognition, machine vision, and others. And then a similar but not exactly the same term is machine learning, which is a form of artificial intelligence where you basically create these algorithms that will try to answer some form of question that humans would be able to answer. Um, so very briefly, before we get to flavor, in agriculture, this is nowadays used quite a bit, for example, to analyze plants. And you have fancy machines, whether they are in growth chambers or in the field, that they can let the computer decide if the plants need more nutrients or if they're responding well to drought. Um, and this allows us a research program to scan a much larger number of plants, right? There's a lot of research now using drones where you fly these vehicles in the field, and you can, for example, look at plant biomass or disease resistance, and and the same thing, for example, for roots. So it is a field that the concept of breeding as a cyclic process is actually simple in nature, but the reality is that nowadays there's a lot of cool innovations in science that are being developed by many different labs and universities. So here is just yet one more example of corn. And this is just for demonstration. This is a regular Excel spreadsheet where we had a system that you get an image of corn, a picture, and normally you wouldn't put that on Excel. This is more just for visualization. So we got the computer to code this picture into just zeros or ones, and which then allows us to look in Excel and we could count how many cells of Excel have one and look at how big this ear of corn is relative to others. Okay, so, and you can see the same formats here. Uh, and we actually developed some methods to take pictures of ears and select what are the best ones that will get to the market. Now, what does that have anything to do with flavor? Just like disease resistance and just like ear length for corn, flavor is a target of breeding potentially, is a trait that breeders can choose to select and to create varieties, fruit and vegetable varieties that are more flavorful. And in Florida, I don't need to say this, but Florida is pretty important when it comes to horticultural crop value in general, right? But so basically, my work, as I described, is mostly in corn and potato. But what I will present now was a collaboration with three breeding programs. In a few weeks, I think Patricio will be here talking about blueberry breeding. And Dr. Harry Klee was the specialist, the geneticist working with tomato flavor. He retired, I believe last year or a couple of years ago. And Dr. Vance Whitaker is the strawberry breeder at UF, and he is based at the GCREC, the Gulf Coast Research and Education Center near Balm, near Tampa. So these three scientists are really the ones that they're developing varieties for these crops, but they had data, they had information that they generated throughout their research career that actually was suitable to test what I'll describe, which is the development of the AI connoisseur. So we collaborated in this. And again, just to briefly talk about tomato in Florida, Florida also leads the country in fresh market production of tomatoes, so it's also an important crop for us. Blueberries, and Patricio can talk a lot better and a lot more about this in a few weeks, but it is one of the few cultivated fruit crops that is native to North America. There are not that many fruits that are actually native to here. And then Florida has also an impressive program and that has created a lot of impact in the form of varieties planted all over the world that were developed here. And strawberry, Florida is the second largest strawberry producing state. There's been surveys that say that strawberries are the favorite fruits of America in general. And so these were three important fruit crops to work with. And the situation is, I described to you what a breeding program in general is, but the reality is that I've also mentioned a few different examples of traits, right? So from the point of view of a grower, of a farmer, the most important trait is yield. If a grower will have to make a decision on, do I buy seeds from variety A or I buy seeds from variety B, the one that produces the most will give me the highest revenue, right? So yield is by far, in any breeding program, the number one trait that you select for. But the reality is that there are a variety of other traits. You look at disease resistance, you look at shape, you look at how pretty it is and how long it lasts in the shelves and so forth. And specifically in Florida, even though these are important crops, the production is actually quite tough. There's a lot of insects, a lot of disease, a lot of pressure in general. So most of the targets for breeding historically were farmer oriented. We needed to develop varieties that adapted to the needs and to the demands of the growers. Think about yield, disease resistance. So the breeders, they had to be producer focused. The farmers are basically the breeders' stakeholders, the direct line of how to get that variety to the public. So in general, there are many examples where many times not by choice, it was just a matter of prioritization that the consumer was left out of the equation. And I think tomato is a great example of that. Uh, we can buy land heirlooms and land races and tomatoes that don't have a lot of history of breeding, and they have a lot more flavor than those big modern regular tomatoes that you buy in the market, right? Um, so I guess all of that to say that the history of breeding for flavor, it's actually, there has not been a lot of flavor breeding historically. And, but yet it's something that's so important, right? And we all love, there is surveys showing that better flavor leads to more consumption, especially in kids. If they really like it, they want more of it. They want the parents to go back and buy more fruits and vegetables. So it's not just about enjoying more or less, but it also drives more consumption. So if you think about flavor, flavor is this complex interaction between the biochemistry of the fruit, the composition of the fruit, and basically how we individually perceive taste, olfaction, and the psychology. If we're in a good mood, we look at a fruit and we like it. If we're not in a good mood, maybe we're like, oh, this didn't taste right today. Um, and it's actually interesting that flavor is a combination between taste, which is what we perceive in our mouth, mostly sugars and acids, right? What our tongue can recognize. And it's a combination of olfaction. And olfaction in itself, there are basically two types. It's whatever we smell through our nose inwards, but there is actually, and that's been demonstrated quite a bit, that there's perception of olfaction as we let the air go out. And there are a few experiments that we can do with peaches or with wine, that if you tap your nose and you drink it or you eat a flavorful fruit and you let it go, basically as the air comes out, you actually perceive a few different aromas. So basically, sugars and acids is mostly perceived in your mouth, and then compounds that are volatiles are perceived in your nose through the smell, right? They're the aromas. And collectively, that's a big chunk of taste. Again, there's some aspects that we're leaving out here, just the psychology of if a fruit is ugly visually, that affects how well we perceive it, right? But here we're talking mostly about the components of the fruits. So how do breeders measure flavor, right? If we're going to select for, I showed you an example where we have these fancy instruments that will take pictures of plants in the field, and ultimately that's what we would have to do. We would have to measure a large number of varieties and decide this one is better than this. So there are basically two ways. There's a lot of science behind consumer sensory panels, right? Food scientists all over the world establish consumer panels. And this is probably the golden standard for flavor analysis. The issues, though, is that we need to assemble large panels. We need usually 100 plus panelists to come and try just a few varieties, right? You usually will feed 4 to 5 different varieties to a panel, and there's no way you're gonna come and say, hey, here is 200 new tomatoes. Some are good, some are bad. Give me a rating for all of them. just doesn't work. So sensory panels end up being expensive, and they're really not compatible with breeding, where we are normally evaluating hundreds, sometimes thousands of varieties. The other option is what I get to do every May, is what we call the bite test. I basically go to the field, and usually per day I will buy 300 to 400 corn plants, different varieties, and write down what I think of it. Now, it's good in the sense that I can actually screen a lot of plants. You can think about a lot of potential issues with that. Is by the end of the day, I'm tired. No matter how good I like my corn, at the end of the day, I'm tired of eating corn. But the other point is that whatever score I give may not match whatever we all like. I mean, it's a sample size of one, right? It's my decision of what's good or bad, which may or not match the average consumers. So we have a disconnect here, and ideally, we would want several people to be measuring several varieties, and that's the challenge that we were presented with, okay? So the objective here was to create a system by which the computer can predict whether a certain variety of fruit or vegetable will be well perceived by a sensory panel. And we call it AI connoisseur. We're not really feeding a blueberry to the computer, but we are extracting the chemical composition of that fruit and providing that data to the computer, and let the computer say, is this going to be well rated? Is this good or is this bad? And that allows us to basically do a lot more varieties. So the reason why we went to, and I'm only showing tomato and blueberries here, but we did the same in strawberries. The reason why we went to these two is because over decades of research, the UF programs, they actually looked at about 200 varieties that were all subjected to sensory panels. So there were several sensory panels, usually 4 or 5 varieties at a time. And throughout the years, they would schedule a few sensory panels, and I think this was a multi-year effort. And the blueberries, same thing. There were 244 varieties. And basically, these cost about $1,000 per variety. So that was a lot of money invested. And you would ask the panelists is, how much do you like this tomato? How sweet is it? How bitter is this tomato? And overall, what's your perception? The same thing for blueberries. What was cool is that the exact same fruits were also sampled and subjected to characterization of or their chemical composition, which is called targeted metabolomics. So now we have a match between, here is what's behind this variety. In the simplest case, you can think about, here's how much sugar it has or how much acid. But like I said, the flavor is more complex. There's also volatiles and things that are perceived by the nose. And we can then create a statistical, a prediction model where the computer links the two things. And if this model is good, in the future, we can actually generate a prediction for about $30 a sample. So there's a significant cost savings there, and that was the rationale behind it. So I'll skip through some of these details, but before we get to the prediction itself, one aspect that was an outcome of this analysis was, okay, now we have all of these compounds. Some of them are sugars, acids, but then also other chemical volatiles, acid-derived amino acids, carotenoids, lipid-derived, phenylalanine-derived. And the question we asked is, okay, here is the total amount of data on how people perceive, in this case, sweetness. We say, okay, how much of these compounds explain the perception of sweetness? Okay, so as you would expect, sugars and acids, they explain a lot of it. So here is in tomato and here is in blueberry. So for example, 60% of the sugar and acid content explain whether or not people will rate that variety as sweet or not. That makes a lot of sense. What was interesting though, and that's especially in tomatoes, but also in blueberries, about 59% of the sugar perception was actually coming from the volatiles themselves. So you can think about, if you're a breeder, I can actually improve how one of us perceives sugar content without increasing sugar itself, right? I can change in the volatile composition, and you perceive that variety to be more sweeter when in fact it doesn't have any more sugar. So we thought that was a pretty cool outcome, which, I'm sorry, this is white, but we did that not only for overall, not only for sweetness, which is the one I just showed you, but for overall liking, sourness, and flavor intensity. And the main outcome here is that if you want to breed for flavor, you shouldn't be just looking at sugar content and acid content. It's not just what our mouth can taste, but also what we can smell and the combination of it. Okay? Um, but that in itself is not really predicting. And we basically checked, okay, can this data predict the consumer panels? And we compare this with a well-established tool in the breeding field that's using the DNA to predict a certain phenotype, which DNA was never able to do a very good job when it comes to flavor. So I'm showing here an accuracy of prediction, and lower numbers basically show you can't do a very good job. When we incorporated the metabolomics, um, prediction values actually increase quite a bit, and we have numbers that go up to like 0.8, which means you can actually do a pretty good job predicting flavor just by looking at the chemical composition of a certain variety. So I left this here just in case someone was interested in the technical aspect of it, although I'm not going to go into details. This work, we tested a variety of machine learning models. So there's different statistical models, and we say, okay, what is the best way to predict these flavor ratings? And ultimately, you generate what are called prediction accuracies that tell you whether you can do a good job or not. But the bottom line is just a combination of sugar and volatiles, and using the information now that the computer learned, we can actually do a pretty good job in identifying which varieties are better or worse. Okay? So how does that apply to breeding itself? Uh, you can think about now, if we make a mistake in developing these models, the computer will create this evil variety. That the reality is that breeding is a long-term process, and breeders are looking for tools that will allow them to screen a larger number of varieties. But the way we are actually envisioning this being done, and we know of breeding programs that are actually deploying this tool, is that in the past, the breeders would start their process with about 10,000 plants, okay? And you would start selecting based on other traits, based on yield, based on resistance. And when you get to your top 10 plants, they're good for everything else, then you subject them to sensory panels and hope that they're going to be good. And you only have 10 to choose from because sensory panels are expensive. And so you can ask Patricio that when he comes, but often you get to the end of the process and some of these varieties are not very good because we're not selecting for them, right? We're not necessarily choosing the best ones, right? They're good for something else. But so the way that we envision this as a tool is that we can actually start, we have a cheaper process to look at sensory perception earlier on. So we let the computer decide the good ones. At the very end of it, once we end up with our final 10, we will still subject them to regular sensory panels. So someone, a group of humans will still go and try them and say, you know, the computer did a pretty good job, but let's move forward with that, or no. But from all we can tell, it seems like we can make much greater gain here. And I think this can very well be relevant in the future. There is a bit of a caveat, which is any breeding program is usually a 10 plus year cycle. So anything we start now will usually, if we're successful, we'll hit the markets at best in 10 years from now. So this is a long process, and it will take time to see how well this will actually get adopted. But I think flavor is a trait that needs to be incorporated in breeding programs. And um, at least the science now is here to help. There are many other questions, which is, for example, will consumers, if I have a variety that yields a little bit less, but is more flavorful, will consumers be willing to pay a little bit more so that the grower can regain that difference in yield, right? That lower yield but higher revenues. There's still a matter of economics there in play, but at least I think allows the breeders to create these varieties and let the market decide. So just as a few more points, and I'll rather have more time for questions to discuss these. I presented to you the prediction aspect of it, which is the computer will say, here is 100 varieties, these are the best ones. Here's a ranking of your best varieties. But in addition to that, one of the outcomes is these are the individual chemical compounds or individual volatiles that contribute to a perception of a different, of a specific trait. So in this case, for example, when we look at sweetness, indeed, glucose and fructose are the highest ones. Again, this is not surprising, right? More the sugar leads to the perception of sweetness. But we have a variety of other compounds that either increase or decrease how you perceive sugar. And what can a breeder do with that? Well, we actually, this was a paper that we published with Harry a few years ago. As long as you know which volatiles, let me skip through this. As long as I know which volatiles are the ones to focus on, so now I have an information and say, and go back and say, trans-2-pentanal is an important one for sweetness perception. I can actually identify regions of the genome of tomato where those genes are controlling trans-2-pentanal. So it connects back with how I explained to you the sweet corn program, that a single gene made a difference in the whole industry. Well, possibly that could be the case for some of these traits too. And it allows us some precision targets to say, let's improve for these compounds so that we can increase perception of sweetness without increasing sugar. So I have a couple more slides. What these models are doing when predicting perceptions, they're predicting average perceptions. So if we were all a group of panelists here, the model would learn on average what we like. What's interesting about these sensory panels is that we go back to the data, pretty much for each variety of the 200 tomato varieties, someone hated it and someone loved it, right? So obviously, there's a lot more that could get improved, which has to do with our cultural experiences, with our demographics, with our psychology, if we're in a good mood or in a bad mood. I can tell you, for example, that, and this is just anecdotal, but for example, I'm from Brazil. Brazilian culture puts a lot more salt in their food. And there's some evidence that the way you then rate salt perception is different than what others would. And just another example is that the cookie or Oreo, the same company will sell here and in Brazil, the exact same product here has a lot more sugar than what's sold in Brazil. And again, these are some of these cultural differences that are not really captured by the model today, but they could. So you could actually target a specific demographic if you chose to. And then just as a follow-up, this work continues in these different crops. I have a colleague in the department that's doing a similar analysis with coffee. If you think about, we could actually figure out what's preferred in coffee and how can we actually improve coffee. And that's an interesting point of view, because a lot of the coffee that Americans drink is not, virtually all of it is not grown here, which creates yet another challenge for consumer sensory research, that we would have to establish sensory panels where people would go to Brazil or to Colombia or elsewhere to try their varieties of coffee there. Just increases the price quite a bit, right? Now, if we have these models and we can predict what kind of coffee Americans like, we can actually Brazilian, Colombian, and breeding programs in Europe, where else they are, they can select for our specific consumer preferences. So anyways, there are several people involved in this work, including folks from the Blueberry Lab, from the Tomato Lab. The first author was my student, Vincent Colantonio, and Charlie Sims from Food Science and Nutrition provided help. Nikolai is a professor in agriculture and biological engineering and funding. And yeah, I think we have plenty of time for questions, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, we're open for questions. Jane?
Well, thank you. The, seems to me there's one obvious thing that's missing, and that is texture. But I don't know exactly how you would create an instrument or something that would detect texture. I'm sure it's talked about in your panels, but to me, that makes all the difference in the world. It doesn't matter how sweet something is, if it's mealy or squishy, it just, yeah, it's not good.
You're absolutely right. So there is quite a bit of research going on in parallel now, and Patricio will be able to comment a little bit more about this. Texture is difficult to rate, to score. So it's just like the ground truth, because these models, we need to a consumer to say, yeah, here's how sweet it is. People don't know well how to rate texture because it mixes with mouthfeel and with crunchiness and chewiness, and there's different ways to define that. Some of the things that the Blueberry Lab was trying to do is to just look at, okay, how hard is it to penetrate a blueberry and just have like a physical measurement of softness, right? And that definitely is an extra feature of that can be incorporated to these models, and that certainly explains quite a bit of flavor as well. It wasn't included here, but it could be done as long as this data was generated.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I've always enjoyed white corn. And I was in Publix today and it looked like the white corn that was out, it looked very dried out. And so I didn't want to purchase it, but you see the yellow corn and the mixed corn much more often. Am I correct that the white corn is sweeter? Better?
It actually is not. So it goes back to one of these cultural preferences. So there are a few things. So let me explain this a little bit more. The gene that makes the corn yellow or white has no influence in flavor. It's a single gene, and we can actually get a yellow variety converted to become white, and their two are identical in flavor. It is possible, though, that some white varieties were more flavorful and were consumed in a certain geography, and that led to the perception that the white variety is more flavorful. So California, West Coast, still today, it's a lot more white corn. Most of the Southeast market is bicolor, so that's the one you find the most nowadays. And I think New England has some yellow corn up north. So it is very, nowadays, the Florida grower will produce all three types, but they will ship to different locations based on market preference.
In your research, have you looped back from what the AI is predicting or showing to see whether people agree with it or not?
Yes. So a lot of when we look into these accuracies of these agreements, what we do is we have the whole data set and we take a piece of it out and we say, okay, let's pretend we don't know for these varieties, what people score them, let the computer predict them, and now you go back and compare. So that's a fair comparison in the sense that these varieties they're like new varieties for the model, but we had the data from the consumers, and then we can compare to see how well they agree on. And those were those 0.8, so 80% accuracies. So there's still a few here and there that don't match perfectly, but normally what a breeder is doing is either selecting the top certain percentage or removing. So if you get a ranking of a few hundred varieties and you can very confidently exclude your bottom 50%, you're already getting a lot of gain there.
You looked a lot at the composition with very complex organic materials that affect the taste. But is there any effect of the chemistry of the soil itself that also contributes to this?
Absolutely. And basically, you think about what leads to a phenotype, in this case, flavor, is a big chunk of it is genetics, a big chunk of it is the environment. Not only soil, but stress, temperature, water, rain, whatnot. And the challenge there from a breeding standpoint is that the genetics can be transferred from one generation to the other. The environment, not necessarily, right? If this year was a warmer year, the growers don't have control over it. So a lot of these environmental variables can be predicted. Like, you know that rain will do something to the flavor, but they can't be controlled. And so yeah, long story short, that happens a lot. We don't know of a way to actually capitalize on it to make better, how to make better fruits out of that.
You mentioned that it took 10 years to bring a trait into this. You don't do any genetic engineering? I think there was for corn all around the
Yeah.
world.
So we do in the lab, mostly for research. So if you want to test a gene, one easy way to do is to create a transgenic of it, and then you see the presence and the absence and compare. The markets nowadays fresh fruit and vegetable markets are not receptive to it. So most breeders, basically this goes into their research box and not into the variety development box. I think potentially this can eventually change. A lot of the traits that back in the days, research on transgenic traits, a lot of it was done in grower-oriented traits. So herbicide resistance, insecticide resistance. And I believe one way to probably change this would be consumer traits. Here is a healthier vegetable. As a matter of fact, there was just a release recently of a tomato that has much higher, I believe, is anthocyanin levels due to a transgenic. It's a transgenic tomato that is healthier, and we'll have to see what's the reception of that. But
Yeah, because I also remember hearing about apples that were genetically altered too, so they wouldn't rust, they wouldn't turn brown when you cut them.
yeah,
That's a consumer desire, but it was with genetic engineering. And is there more acceptance of genetic engineering now among consumers, or there's still a lot of resistance?
I think there's still a lot of resistance. I think there's a lot of misconception,
Mm.
and then that all cases get pulled into a GMO is bad no matter what, and
Yeah.
and then there's also branding that goes into it, right? For example, for the majority of fruits and vegetables, there has never been GMO commercialized. But yet you will see products in the market that say non-GMO.
Yeah,
So that's like the
right.
reverse branding. Is like, no, we don't do it. Yeah, nobody else does it. But
Same for gluten-free, something that never had gluten,
Yeah.
they'll say gluten-free on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation. I couldn't help but just make a side comment, and that's AI.
Hold it.
That's it, artificial intelligence. Yeah, and the Persians used to do artificial insemination for the first time centuries and centuries ago. And then in 1930s, they had artificial insemination in dairy cattle, beef cattle, where that's common. So then when this artificial intelligence came out, anybody that works in some of these other areas misreads it, writes it down wrong, everything else, because you kind of cloned our name in terms of artificial intelligence. So I was getting interviewed one time, and somebody brought this up to me and says, you know, why do you call this artificial insemination? And I said, well, we've been doing artificial insemination for many years. So you should have used a different name. And she said, well, what name would you suggest? And I said, how about fabricated intelligence?
That's more like it, yeah.
Thank you so much. As a farmer's daughter and a mother who had her garden that I grew up in, and we would go out, of course, pick the ears of corn and pop it in the pot. But being the modern person I am, I cook all my sweet corn in the microwave. And so I think how corn is cooked is really important also as to how it's perceived, the texture, the flavor, the whole thing.
Absolutely. Is I think that that has a big effect on it. And even when boiling, a lot of the times people tend to overboil. So
Yeah,
the best way to get that crunchiness out is to just leave it for a few minutes. If you leave for 10+ minutes, it loses a bit of the texture. Um, we I mentioned that I go to the field to bite the corn, and there's no way to cook it, right? So we eat raw, which is actually my favorite way to eat corn because it tastes more like a fruit. Like we did a sensory panel with Charlie Sims out of the food science department, where we gave people raw and cooked corn, and they basically some people like more the raw corn, some people like there was a mix, but overall it was well perceived by both treatments were well perceived.
yeah. I suppose method of cooking is another variable you have to include in your
And
consumer satisfaction.
and the other point is like from the breeding point of view, we're controlling the varieties. But if the supermarket don't do a good job keeping them, whether it's refrigerated or selling them quickly, a lot of the times, I mean, I personally I think that there's a big gap in quality from the corn that we can harvest in the field, any variety, and the corn that we can buy in the supermarket, just because they sit outside of the
Yeah.
cold
What
storage for long.
I heard somebody say that the best corn is where you have your pot of boiling water, then you go out and pick the corn and rub it in
That's right. That's right.
instantly. I have one more question, and that's related to potato. How do you, it's just a curiosity, how, I mean, you transfer the genetic traits to the seed, but potatoes you plant from another potato. How do you transfer a genetic trait in a species like potato?
Yeah, so
What's the method?
we can still cross potatoes, so
Yeah.
we can still create a true seed. But it's interesting, I mentioned that it takes 10+ years to develop a variety. I make a cross and I generate a new variety in 6
Of
months.
the potato.
Of potatoes in 6 months.
Yeah.
The next 9.5 years are clonally propagating that variety and extensively testing in different growers and in different conditions to make sure that that variety is to be released. So basically, I still shuffle their genetics, but once a seed is produced, a true seed, and that plant that's born out of it will produce tubers, will produce potatoes, the potato then is propagated clonally, so it's the exact same genetics
So
that's
it'll have that.
propagated.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I had the same type of question when I heard a talk on tulips. The way they, I said, how do you transfer it on bulbs? How
Yeah.
do you transfer the genetic information? It's the same
Yes,
process.
it's the same. And then once a variety is produced, it's actually then easier because a grower, they're usually up north. Maine, for example, the state of Maine is a big producer of potatoes, and they call it seeds, but what they're producing is actually tubers, and they'll produce a field of the exact same variety because they're all clonally propagated. We'll harvest those potatoes, ship it to Florida, and that's what the growers plant. And then basically
I see.
that's why they're the seeds, but they're not true
They're not
seeds.
real seeds. Okay, okay. So that's a misnomer. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. Are there any more questions on Zoom, Julianne? No. Okay. Thank you, Marcio, so much. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
New information, wonderful.
Thank you.
Our next speaker next week is, if I can find it, yes, that's Dr. Adesogan. He's an associate vice president and director of global food systems. I think you heard people mention that IFAS and the United States is responsible for feeding a large part of the world. So he will be talking on improving global food and nutritional security around the world. Please come for that. Thank you all for coming.